Good morning and welcome to IEA's eighth webinar of the year 2024. Uh, we will be focusing on the cost of trade disruptions in the Red Sea. Thank you for joining us, and we will start the meeting as other people as other people join. So today's webinar is focusing on the cost of trade disruptions at the Red Sea. We will be going through the effect of attacks by the Houthi rebels on Red Sea on the cost of trade and on the cost of doing business and its implications in Kenya, particularly for our import and export sector. So this webinar will be carried out by the International Trade and Development Program under the IEA, and our main presenter for the day is Emmanuel, who is a program officer in the International Trade and Development Program. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Emmanuel to take us through this session. Thank you. And in case you may have any comments or questions, you may utilize the chat box to type in your comments or questions as Emmanuel presents. And then after he finishes presenting, we'll have a plenary session whereby you will be free to raise your hands and ask any question or any comments that you may have. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Welcome.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll take that again from the top. My apologies for those technical difficulties we just experienced. My name is Emmanuel Wachendo. I am a program officer here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and today's presentation concerns the crisis in commercial shipping and seaborne trade. The objective of this webinar is to understand what is going on with commercial shipping at the Bab el Mandeb Strait and what are the costs of these trade disruptions and who should care and what exactly is being done at the moment, right? So the Bab el Mandeb Strait is it's a strait is basically a geographical region where um, so next slide, please. The Bab el Mandeb Strait is a politically contested geographical region. Disruptions to shipping at the Bab el Mandeb choke point have implications uh, directly on revenues enjoyed by the Egyptian-owned Suez Canal, the costs incurred by those operating merchant ships, and the costs incurred by those who have rented ships, and the cost in the insurance costs that will be charged to because of the political tensions and the attacks that are happening at the Bab el Mandeb. So what exactly is happening now from an economic perspective? You have a situation where this insurgency group has found it very, very efficient to carry out attacks on merchant shipping. They're finding it efficient because the Bab el Mandeb being a choke point means the cost of disrupting global shipping and really inflicting pain on the direct economic cost on those who operate these ships, and indirect political costs on those who administer the regions from which these ships come from. Is, the cost is very low, the returns are very high because of what you get in terms of the downstream effects of disrupting this trade, and so it has made for a very attractive target. How serious is this threat? 95% of the volume of sea trade conducted by European Union member states passes through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Bab el Mandeb choke point. 20% of global trade, or 4.2 trillion, passes through the Gulf of Aden. The Yemeni coastline is situated along the Gulf of Aden. Previously, there was a Operation Atalanta, or the European Union Naval Force mission in the region that was designed to suppress piracy. Seen from an economic perspective, there was an effort by different actors, including the European Union, to actually reduce the to address the market failure that is piracy, providing this kind of a global public good that is security, so that maritime shipping can go on, and maritime shipping being and the value of shipping passing through that area being very, very high meant that suppressing piracy has been was an important policy. If we take Operation Atalanta alone, Operation Atalanta had a budget of 5.1 million euros. So I want you to keep that number in mind, because it's at least one number that tries to fix what the cost of providing public goods in the region, the public good of security, has been, and as we continue to understand the cost of these attacks. Now, another important thing to note about these attacks is that the Houthis are using technology that might not have been available 20 or 30 years ago, right? There's missiles that have been developed by Iran that they're using, and they're using drones, both unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned surface vehicles. Seen from an economic perspective, right? What did you have? You had the piracy was actually suppressed to the point that by 2019 you had almost zero cases of piracy. The maritime authorities and commercial interests who assess risk and then also inflict or dole out an insurance cost actually reduced the cost of insurance that they were charging on shipping passing through the area, right? So that 5.1 million euros that I mentioned earlier actually was an effective, you could say, if whatever other numbers exist, if they're not far beyond this 5.1 million euro, then that means that the cost of providing this public good relative to the returns generated by providing this public good were actually pretty favorable, right? It was pretty cost effective. Now, Israel, there's some, you all know what's happening over there politically, and the Houthis took this opportunity to say, look, we are disrupting this shipping because we want a change of Middle East policy, the policy being carried out by Israel and whoever else that they believe is politically aligned with Israel. So how did they do this? They launched missiles and they've sunk at least one ship and basically attacking maritime shipping moving through the area. So this is the emergence of a market failure. Now, what happened was, as part of the response, saw some of those assets actually that were being dedicated to suppressing piracy actually move and try to address the issue with the Houthis. Now, the result of that was that the pirates who have been operating off the Somali coast also found an opportunity to attack. Now, all that put together, presently, more and more ships are not passing through the Bab el-Mandeb. They're taking the Suez Canal route. They're going down to the Cape of Good Hope. That means that journeys that used to take 34 days are now taking 43 days, right? If you're traveling from, if shipment was moving from, say, you have almost 15 to 20 days additional of travel in the sea. Next slide, please. Now, to add a bit of context, the Yemeni per capita income is about $366. These political operatives are able to carry out these attacks because of the political dysfunction that's going on in that country. So you have, you can see, even just judging from the per capita incomes, this is a very vulnerable population. There's a lot of desperation. There's malevolent opportunism, because one thing that an economist can at least see from this is that getting recruits to fill these ranks has become very cheap because of the political dysfunction. And then again, the choke points offer a low cost, low risk, high return opportunity to engage in misbehavior. Next slide, please. Now, here is a picture of the Ruby Mar cargo ship sinking just in 27th February of 2024, just to show how effective these attacks have been. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or the Gate of Tears, as it's known in Arabic. The length is about 50 kilometers, the width about 26 kilometers, and the average depth around 186 meters. So this shows us why the Houthis, who don't have a navy necessarily, can carry out these attacks, right? Next slide, please. And here again, you see the picture of the Bab el-Mandeb from space. Next slide. Now, on this chart, we can see global choke points. There are in red the primary global choke points for maritime shipping. So specifically, we're concerned with how trade is carried out through the sea, because physical goods must move across the ocean, and we can see the points at which, when and if disruptions occur, how they can be costly. And that's why it's a choke point, because you basically are choking the movement of trade. So as soon as you choke the Bab el-Mandeb, you have fewer ships that can access the Suez Canal, and more ships must then go south if they're coming from the east and from as far as the Strait of Malacca and beyond. Next slide, please. So we mentioned again that 95% of the volume of sea trade conducted by European Union member states passes through the Suez Canal. This is important because this means that that those ships are, if 90% of the volume of sea trade conducted by EU member states must pass through the Bab el-Mandeb, then if those goods are still being transported, then their cost is actually increased. So in general, one might expect that the EU would respond vigorously. And that's one of the questions that we're going to continue to explore, is who should care and why? Next slide, please. So that globally, 20% of global trade, or 4.2 trillion, right, on average, if you take for the last 5 years, 20% of global trade passes through the Gulf of Aden. Now, the Gulf of Aden is the region before the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So ships come in, they enter the Gulf of Aden, they pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and then they go into the Red Sea and onwards to the Suez Canal. Next slide, please. Now, ships that have decided they must pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait have been, as recently, or 2 months ago in December, already ships that might be judged or determined by these political actors to be related to Israel in any way were being advised that as they pass through, they should take action to reduce their signature. So, for example, this might include, but not be limited to, actions like turning off their transponders, or basically reducing their communication. Usually you have a port of call where you report that you are passing through a certain region or stopping at a specific port. Now, ships were being advised not to do that. As you can see, for piracy between 2019 and October 2023, we had 0 attacks. But as soon as the Houthis attacked ships and at the Strait, and more resources the few resources that were there dedicated to suppressing piracy were rededicated towards addressing the Houthi threat, then you had a re-emergence of piracy. So on January 2023, the shipping industry had removed the high-risk area designation from the Indian Ocean. This was a response to the suppression of piracy in the region. So just very recently, and not more than 11 months, not less than 11 months later, you had an attack, and the shipping industry is again changing this designation. And you can see that already risk premiums are rising. Next slide, please. How has the Suez Canal been affected? Now, on this chart, we can see how the effect of the attack on transit calls at the Suez Canal. So transit calls at the Suez Canal have fallen from a 7-day moving average of 77 ships per day on 5th November 2023 to a 7-day moving average of 55 ships a day on 4th January 2024. So this chart illustrates that the transit trade volume at the Suez Canal, next slide, please. The transit calls at the Suez Canal, the trade volume moving through the canal also fell from a 7-day moving average of 5.2 million tons just 2 days before, on 5th November, just about a month before the terror attack in Israel, to a 7-day moving average of 3.296 million tons on 4th January 2024. Next slide, please. So here we can see, okay, an illustration of the types of goods that pass through the Suez Canal. So the top 3 traded industries with goods passing through the Suez Canal were the petrochemical and non-metallic mineral products, mining and quarrying, and agriculture. So here, these are the kinds of ships that carry this cargo, right? Tankers carry the petroleum and petrochemical products. So that's 29% of the ships that were passing through, of the vessels that were passing through. Dry bulk ships usually carry agricultural products, right? Containers in general can carry a bit of both, if I'm not mistaken. Next slide, please. So the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait register about 19.3 thousand and 19.09 thousand transit calls annually. So you can see that there is a kind of a relationship between the number of ships that pass through the Bab el-Mandeb and the number of ships that pass through the Suez. So it's not many ships that are stopping in Sudan, for example. Now here we have a chart that shows us just three of the top most busiest ports in the world in terms of volume of goods that pass through these ports, right? Shanghai, China. So you could see that the most at least three out of the top 10, and there's many, many more, right? So I picked the top 3, and the top 3 were all in Asia. So this is to give us a feel for how much shipping would actually, how important the Bab el-Mandeb Strait would be. Next slide, please. Now, getting down to the straits themselves, right? On the left side of this chart, you can see the ranks of different straits in terms of the number of annual transit calls. The next column shows the names of these straits. The next column, the top traded industries. So for the products passing through this strait, and then the average annual number of transit calls um, for these straits. So the Taiwan Strait is the most important. Now, again, there is a difference between a strait and a port, right? A strait, usually ships are passing through. It's strait and choke points are not exactly synonymous. That's why you have the Suez Canal on this list, right? The Suez Canal is not a port, although it, ships do stop in Egypt, but it's an area that it's a canal, right? Ships are passing through. So you can see that the Bab el Mandeb Strait is ranked just a little bit higher than the Suez Canal, but they are 8th and 9th respectively in terms of the most important choke points globally. Next slide, please. Here, this chart shows us the risks that each of these choke points are actually exposed to. So the important choke points are exposed to. So we could see the Panama Canal, the Suez. I want us to focus on the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of the Bab el Mandeb, because the risks that these three choke points are facing right now are actually emblematic of two major problems that the world is facing, right? So the Panama Canal, very high risk for flood and drought. The Strait of Bab el Mandeb, there's a high risk of conflict and terrorist attack. And then the Suez Canal, there's a high risk of terrorist attack. So right now, globally, we have these political tensions, and we have, on the one hand, that the world must contend with, and then we have climate change, right? And all the kinds of the experiences, both the environmental and climatic challenges that the world is facing. And here we can see what effects that those two groups of challenges have on global trade, the kinds of costs that they threaten to incur or are already inflicting on global trade. So right now, the Panama Canal actually is facing a challenge in terms of drought. There's a drought. That means if there's a drought at the Panama Canal, and the Panama Canal needs water, right? So you have a shortage of water. So that makes it more difficult for especially heavier ships, right? Because heavier ships will need more depth. In order to give them the depth that they need to pass through all the locks on the Panama Canal and move from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you need water. To close that off, the Ministerial Conference 13 of the World Trade Organization, which is the forum that convenes trade ministers around the world to hash out matters in global trade. They have begun to look at how to tackle climate and environmental issues at the forum that is dedicated to global trade, right? So already they naturally had to deal with political challenges, but now they're also including climate and environment in their agenda. Whether or not it is advisable is another question, but that is just showing how these challenges are now translating to global policy making. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture that just give a flavor of what all that we've talked about. He who can destroy a thing controls it, in the words of Frank Herbert's fictional character, Paul Muad'Dib. And here he's something of a extremist, and he's riling up his people to go and attack a fictional choke point, right? The spice melange in that fictional story, right? There's these parallels with these political actors who have taken a political and religious stance against a certain people who they have chosen as their adversaries. They're telling us that, look, Israel is our adversary, and because we do not like what they're doing, we're going to disrupt trade. So in a similar way that Paul does in that story. Next slide, please. And there they are conducting one of their attacks on trade. Now, here we have, so far we've seen that the importance of global public goods, right? There had been an anti-piracy effort, a multi-year anti-piracy effort, inviting actors from all around the world, including the European Union. Recently, there was a pirate ship whose attack was actually repelled by the Indian Navy, right? And so these soldiers from the Indian Navy seized the ship and arrested pirates, and those pirates have now been taken to India where they're being processed. So here before us, we have Article 105, seizure of a pirate ship or aircraft. This is Article 105 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. So sorry, here it says United Nations is not signatory. It actually is a typo. The United States is not signatory to the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. But what does this convention say? So on the high seas or any other place outside the jurisdiction of any state, giving the state a right to seize the parameters around which a state may actually disrupt piracy and then go on and actually process the pirates. Now, what state legislators then have to do, they have to legislate their own domestic laws, right? Create a legal mechanism to punish this piracy, which is what India did. So by the time they came and interdicted a pirate ship and took the pirates back to India, right? When they provided this public good, because we all benefited from it, right? They have also created laws to address and to actually process these pirates. So we have the problem of piracy on the one hand, a market failure. It's not so security, safety, public security, national defense are public goods. Public institutions are the ones best suited to respond. Next slide, please. Now, this slide shows us the growing significance of global trade. So in 1976, the tonnage of goods shipped around the world was 3.3 million. By 2021, it was 10.99 million. Between 2011 and 2021, actually dry cargo took the most important share of growth in volume of goods traded by shipping, right? So, whereas for many years, let's say, take petroleum and petrochemicals have been an important mainstay of global trade, but more and more other dry goods are increasing in their importance to global trade, right? And it's only in the 5-year period between 1981 and 1986 that the world saw a drop in the tonnage of goods traded worldwide. So since 86, the tonnage of goods shipped worldwide has continued to grow. Now, again, when we go back to the period 2016 and 2021, the volume of crude oil shipments actually fell by 7%. right? So while you had the volume of dry goods growing, the volume of crude oil shipments is falling. And the value again of another good that is coming to define the incoming era, the semiconductor chip, right? Global trade in semiconductor chip is actually edging the value of the global trade in petroleum, right? So we had an era defined by trade in petroleum. Now it's being defined by chips. Next slide, please. Next slide. So all that previous slide. So what can the Ever Given crisis teach us about today's crisis? And why am I asking this question about the Ever Given? So we want to understand what the cost of this disruption in shipping is. So just about over a year ago, we had a ship called the Ever Given actually run aground at the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is just after the Bab el Mandeb Strait. So it's a perfect experiment for us to just try and understand what the cost of this Bab el Mandeb crisis could be. So on March 23rd, 2021, the Ever Given runs aground at the Suez Canal, and the effects of this incident on global supply chains were felt for many months that followed. Next slide. So, on average, 52 ships So on average, 52 ships make the 200-kilometer Suez Canal passage. What we want to see is, okay, how many ships might not be passing there right now? The cost of chartering a ship to cross the world can be as high as $100,000 daily. The Ever Given blocked the canal for a total of 6 days. This is about 312 ships daily. Now, in actual fact, about 400 ships were prevented from making the crossing, right? So one estimate of the direct cost of this disruption was 1 billion euros, right? How was this arrived at? We'll see. Now, another component of the cost is this. The shipping company that owns the Ever Given declared a general average. A general average is a situation where you lose some of your goods in the sea for whatever reason, or you incur some losses, and now the owners of the goods who did not incur losses will help to pay for those goods that were actually lost because of whatever imperiled the shipment. So the compensation was not published, but it was about $500 million, right? This is just for 6 days. And the cost of delay for intermediate inputs was estimated to be 250 million to 400 million euros. So here you can see there was a direct cost. The direct costs incurred by the Suez Canal Authority. There's money that they can no longer earn. There are shipments that fail to make it on time. Some goods may have been lost. So the value, those who lost value throughout this period had to help pay, were compensated in some way, right? And let's get a bit deeper into it. Next slide, please. Now here we have a chart that tries to put what we just said into a format that we can understand, right? So the daily cost of chartering one ship is about $100,000. So specifically, if you were at sea for 6 days, you're waiting for the canal to be unblocked, you were incurring a cost of about $600,000 per day. So if this was 312 ships, right? If you take that 52 times 6, 52 ships passing through the canal every day times 6, about $187.2 million. But in actual fact, 400 ships were prevented from making the crossing. So this raises the cost to about 240 million, right? Now, here we're presented with another problem, because as soon as you hear that the canal has been blocked, you need to make a decision either to wait or to go down south and go through the South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. Now, either way, whether you are diverted or you wait, there's that cost component, but there's also a cost component for the delay of linking up with onward transport. That's the delay of someone is waiting for you on the other side to move the goods further. There's a cost that you incur because of that delay. Next slide, please. Now here we have a chart that shows so if a different analyst from another insurance firm, right, called Greco, they estimated that passing through the Suez Canal costs around $300. So this chart is trying to calculate the cost of just passing through the Suez Canal. And this chart is showing us that passing through the canal, so if you had to pay $300,000, right? This is for 6 days, and back please. Yes, for 6 days, and you're incurring about $561 million dollars. If it was 400 ships, then that's about $720 million. So what is this? Again, this is if you were gonna pay $300,000 to the Suez Canal authorities, right? So if those ships didn't pass through, or rather that time that they're waiting, then the Suez Canal Authority is losing between half a billion and just under $1 billion in that 6 days of trying to unblock the canal. Next slide, please. Now, here we have the damage to the canal and supply chain related costs, right? Now, what this chart is trying to show is to add the supply chain related costs, the damage to the canal, and the total cost, and try to give us how much it costs per minute to be waiting. So here we change the time delay to 7 days because the time that it took actually for the whole crisis to blow over was between 6.5 to 7 days. So that means that the damage to the canal and supply chain related costs were about $74,000. 74,000 euros a minute at the low bound, or 89,000 euros a minute at the high bound. What is this saying? Again, so this is a different estimate to how much in how the cost inflicted on the Port of Suez authority, so the authorities that operate the canal, about $500 million. This is an estimate by Greco Services. and that supply chain related costs. So we described previously what those supply chain costs were. That's the cost of someone waiting for you on the other side with these goods that are failing to pass through the canal because they're stuck at the canal, right? So that's about 250,000, 250 million euros, right? So you put that together, just under €1 billion, and that comes up to about anywhere between 70,000 and 90,000 euros a minute. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now here, before us, there was yet another estimate of the cost of damage, right? So this 1 billion euros is actually another estimate that was obtained by Greco Services that said, okay, we think that in total, actually, that the direct cost, so that's the cost directly incurred because of your shipments are not passing through, they're waiting somewhere. The port of Suez is losing money, right? Just those direct costs. So this is not insurance or supply chain related costs, was about €1 billion or just under 100,000 euros per minute. Next slide. So that's all that direct cost estimate here is converted into dollars. So it's again just below $1 billion or 90,000 or $91.26 thousand a minute. Next slide. So what we've shown so far is there's just so many numbers because of how difficult it is to estimate the cost of such delays, right? Now, that being said, here we look at the cost of delay for supply chain, supply chain and intermediate inputs. So we go back again to that cost component that estimates the cost of delaying inputs that needed to get to somewhere. So let's say a shipment is goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, gets to the Suez Canal, gets stuck and couldn't make it to Greece, where maybe it was destined for a factory. So this could be a computer chip, right? Could be a set of computer chips for auto manufacturers somewhere in Europe, right? So the value of the freight was estimated to be, let's say, between $3 billion and $9 billion. So that means that in those 7 days, the cost to supply chain and intermediate inputs was between 2.1 and $6.3 million a minute. So this is an estimate given by the International Chamber of Shipping. So they estimated that the value of daily freight related to that was destined for supply chain and intermediate inputs was about $3 billion to $9 billion. Next slide, please. So now, economists David Hummels and George Schwarr actually provided another estimate for how much delays, the cost of delays, the cost that delays incur on shipments. So here, next slide. So here we see that. So we take that $3 billion, right? This is the low bound assumption. If you had shipments whose value destined for as intermediate inputs, right? Or that needed to travel onwards through the supply chain and get to some final destination, and they were valued at about 3 billion. Then these two economists estimated that the cost of delay will be about 0.6% and 2.3% of the total value, right? So their assumption is that it's actually costing them about 12.5 thousand and 48,000, between 12.5 thousand and $48,000 to in delays, right? And next slide. So this goes up to not to if to about 30, between 37.5 thousand and 143.75 thousand dollars if you take the $9 billion cost assumption, right? Next slide. So all these numbers that are, admittedly, it's a tornado, it's a deluge of statistics, and you're trying to estimate the direct cost of delays, um, and the indirect cost of having inputs actually delayed because they can't pass through a specific maritime choke point. And it's just showing how difficult it can be to try to estimate the cost. Because here again, the Suez Canal Authority itself had its own estimate about the cost to parties, right? A delay of 1 week alone cost the parties about 1 billion total, right? Allianz, international financial services provider, they put the total losses to 10 billion US dollars. Now, next slide. So far we've seen that there is piracy, there are terrorist activities motivated by certain circumstances. They're very costly. Now, one might think that sending warships to respond is a very costly enterprise, and which it is for a private provider, but for the public, it's a different question. And how economics tells us that the conditions under which public goods should be provided, right? And then the very nature of these public goods. We've seen that the cost incurred can be very, very high, but it can also be difficult to estimate what these costs are. But that finally the costs are not as simple as just someone who has to pay more for a trip, because not only do they have to pay more for the trip, if they're the merchant operator, maybe they need to buy more fuel, they need to change direction, so they're gonna be traveling longer. And then if these goods are destined for some manufacturer, there are some the costs of delay in supply of intermediate inputs, and then also the cost of supplying final goods later than they were expected or than they should have been. There's the very fact that you're getting costs transferred to the consumer. There are insurance costs that will rise. All this helps us to understand when something as dramatic as even the Indian Navy responding is an attempt to actually address these costs. So if we provide a credible deterrent, we could try and suppress and actually cause the market to return to more favorable conditions. This slide here before us shows us that growth in seaborne trade will not abate. It will continue to rise. Here we have a prediction by It's the a combination of sources from the United Nations and the OECD, predicting that seaborne trade will just continue to rise. So we're going to continue to rely on the seas more and more. There isn't an airplane that can carry some of these heavy goods that we need, right? The other alternative, which is taking goods by road, is also not as cost effective as taking them by sea. And in fact, not only is the sea more cost effective per product, per product, it's also I mean, compared to road transportation, transportation by sea also reduces emissions. Next slide, please. So shipping for the EU alone, shipping takes about 80% of imports and 50% of export volumes. No, sorry, 80% of import and export volumes and 50% of the value of trade, of EU trade alone. Next slide, please. Here we have the cost of insurance, right? This is the Drewry World Container Index. So the Drewry World Container Index it's a proxy actually for the evolution in the freight rates of 40-foot containers. 40-foot containers is the average size of containers in which cargo is carried by sea. So they actually track the spot rates and short-term contract rates on 40-foot containers. And they found that on the 5th October 2023, right, the WCI, the World Container Index, was $1,389, right? By 25th January, it had risen to $3,964, right? 185% rise in cost of insurance. Another source called Container News, they reported that charter rates for large box ships had experienced surges between 29% and 53% higher in 2024 than they had been in the same period in 2019, right? So we can see that illustrated in this chart, just that dramatic rise. So whether the goods were going from Shanghai to Rotterdam, right? Shanghai to Rotterdam, very likely to pass through the Bab el Mandeb, insurance costs are up. If they're going from Shanghai to Genoa, it's I think in Europe, Italy, I believe, again, the insurance costs are up. The WCI for Shanghai to New York and Shanghai to LA was also up, right? But not as dramatic as the others that presumably must pass through the Bab el Mandeb Strait. Next slide, please. Next slide. So there was a claim by the Houthis that they are trying to target Israel and its allies in these attacks, right? Repeated attempts to get the Security Council to condemn these attacks were, well, when other security members were eager to condemn the Houthis, China and Russia were not, which presumably was because they were coordinating politically with the Houthis, who are proxies of Iran. But if we look a little bit closer, we see that the picture of seaborne trade is more complex than that, than flags on ships, right? So here we have a chart that shows us different dimensions of seaborne trade and the nations that are involved in those dimensions, and then the intensity to which they are involved, right? When it comes to recycling of ships, Bangladesh in 2022, actually the bulk of recycling operations was Bangladeshi, right? Shipbuilding, 47% of ships being built in 2022 were built by China, 29% by Korea. When we look at seafarers, so the people who actually man the ships, 13% were Filipino. So you could, presumably attack one ship and claim this is an Israeli ship, end up killing Filipino citizens, and then attack another ship and say, or refuse to attack another ship and say, no, this one is Chinese or Russian affiliated, only to turn out that that too is carrying and being operated by Filipino seafarers, right? And then you attack another one, say this is American, and maybe the seafarers aboarded are Russian. So now these are only presumptions that I raise when just looking at this chart. I have not actually seen any news item like this, but the fact that just 2 or 3 days ago, it was reported that China and Russia were trying to negotiate with the Houthis not to attack the ships or something of that nature, I think even that shows how complex it can be, because it was assumed that their ships were not being attacked. But here they are saying, look, trying to negotiate something out of it. Now, that's the political side of this question. We can already see also the difficulty in providing these public goods, because the attacks have been occurring since at least November last year, and we haven't seen a decisive blow leveled on the Houthis, right? Now, from a public goods perspective, there's enduring market failure in this area. Next slide, please. How important is the Suez Canal to the region? To try and land all these threads, right, and sew them together to where we are. Here is a chart by UNCTAD that shows that for Kenya, 15% of Kenya's trade volumes, or 12% of Kenyan exports, pass through the Suez Canal. 12% of Kenyan and 15% of Kenyan imports pass through the Suez Canal. And this is in tonnage, so it's not in trade value, but in terms of trade volume, right? 10% of the volume of Tanzanian trade, or 8% of its exports and 11% of its imports, come through the Suez Canal. Now, next slide. Here we have the Linus Shipping Connectivity Index, which indicates a country's integration level into global Linus shipping networks. So the global, so Kenya and Tanzania are actually above the world median, the global average, right? Djibouti's Linus Shipping Connectivity Index is 34.8, so it's the highest in this part of the world, on this continent, right? But the highest in the world in 2021 Q4 was actually China with 175.73. Singapore was at 113. The United States at 94. What does this all mean, right? Singapore and Djibouti are very small nations, very, relatively small economies, although Singapore's is bigger than Kenya, I believe. I think it's at 500 billion. But it shows that liner shipping connectivity index is trying to estimate how connected a country's ports are to the world. Next slide. Here we can see that when you look at the map and look at the northeast quadrant, say, right, the top left corner, and you could just make out Kenya and Tanzania as visible blips in the country and port level liner shipping connectivity index, right? So that means that these countries are actually relatively well connected to the world. And again, their connectivity is above average. So not only is their connectivity to the world above average, but these countries actually an important volume of their trade passes through the Bab el Mandeb Strait. Next slide. So this is just a quick one to tell us how the index is calculated. So it takes the number of scheduled ship calls per week in a port, the capacity offered by the port, right? The number of regular lining shipping services to and from the port, the size of the largest ships that move between the ports, that go back and forth into that port, and the number of ports connected to a given port through direct liner shipping services. So next slide. Basically, if you put this on a per capita basis, actually it turns out that Kenya and Tanzania should actually care more than Germany, right? So Kenya and Tanzania together make up more than 57% of the EAC's of the East Africa community's gross domestic product. So they're the nations with the largest economies. The Kenyan and Tanzanian ports actually serve the region all the way into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and a significant important share of their trade in volumes actually passes through the canal. So their trade is actually being affected by the crisis of the Bab el Mandeb. So when you think about some of those dizzying costs, so Kenya and Tanzania would be or could be implicated in some of those costs. So even if a Kenyan or a Tanzanian ship or a ship carrying goods destined for the region are not attacked, they might still have to pass through somewhere else. And there's all these other disruptions that they will face. And so it turns out that even on a per capita basis, we should care more than Germany. So in closing, this is a situation calling for the provision of public goods, of security. No private firm would provide these goods because they could not capture, they will not capture the greater share of the returns, right? The returns will be captured mostly as externalities for the greater public. So it's not so profitable to go and, maybe, I don't know, arrest some pirates and go looking for them and suppress their activity, because you're not getting most of the benefit from it, right? In following that kind of economic logic. And furthermore, it might not be as easy as killing a few pirates, because you have the Houthis in Yemen launching rockets and, relatively sophisticated insurgent activity, right? They have developed new technology. They've become more efficient they've increased the efficiency of their particular brand of insurgency activity. So Kenya and Tanzania should actually care. And I think to close all of that, you can see the cost of political dysfunction, the cost that political dysfunction incurs on the globe, the outsized cost that it incurs on global trade and interconnectivity. And with that, I close this presentation.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for the very good presentation you've given on the cost of trade disruptions at the Red Sea. So I'll just give a brief summary of some of the statistics that Emmanuel has shared with us. Meanwhile, you can prepare your questions. There's an icon on your screen. There's a hand icon on your screen that you can use it to raise your hands, and I'll see it and give you an opportunity to make your give your question or your comments. We also have a chat box that you can utilize to write your questions, and I'll read after I'm done with the summary. So Emmanuel has informed us that 95% of volume of sea trade conducted by EU passes through the Bab el Mandeb and the Suez Canal, and 20% of global trade trade worth $4.2 trillion passed through the Gulf of Aden, then to Bab el Mandeb and Suez Canal and Red Sea. Emmanuel has also showed us the cost of disruptions through the moving 7-day average of ships in the Suez Canal. In November 2023, it was at 77, and as at January 2024, it reduced to 55 ships per day. And he's also illustrated the types of goods that pass through the Suez Canal. That's petroleum and petrochemical products, mining and quarrying, agricultural products. He's also shown us that the busiest ports in the world, Shanghai in China, Singapore, and also Ningbo in China, all in Asia, also utilize the Suez Canal, and therefore, and he's also given us the value of trade that passes through the tonnage of ships that have been happening globally through the sea, and it has been growing from 3.3 million tonnage of goods shipped in 1976 to 10.9 million tonnage of goods shipped in 2021. So the trade in using the shipping has been growing over the years. He's also given the risks according to the global trade risks choke points. In Bab el Mandeb, the risks that have been ranked from medium to high risks are on conflict, terrorist attack, and piracy. And in Suez Canal, the risks that have been shown is on storms, haze and fog, and terrorist attack. And these risks have an effect on the insurance costs as they continue rising, particularly for goods that are passing through Bab el Mandeb and Suez Canal. And then he's given an illustration of the Ever Given ship that was stuck in Suez Canal and the kind of costs that were incurred in terms of damage to the canal and also supply chain related costs. And we've seen that the total direct costs were close to 100,000 euros per minute, and the supply chain costs were between 750 million euros to 900 million euros on the higher bound. And the cost of supply chain and intermediate inputs on the Ever Given ship situation that happened in Suez Canal, it was about $2.1 million to $6.2 million per minute. And economists estimated that the total cost of delays between 0.6% to 2.3% of the value of freight. And he's also told us that the growth in seaborne trade is bound to continue to rise. We're looking at variables such as the world population, world economy GDP, and and also the world sea trade bond carried in tons. We also have is illustrated what the EU trading that takes place in the shipping, that takes place through shipping, and it is about 80% of imports and exports, and about 50% of the value of trade, showing the importance of seaborne trade. Then he's brought this closer home to the region, showing that 15% of Kenya's trade volumes pass through Suez Canal, 12% of Kenyan exports, and 15% of Kenyan imports. When you break it down in terms of imports and exports pass through the Suez Canal. And then using the liner shipping connectivity index, we've seen that which shows how connected country ports are to the world. We've seen that China has the highest at 175.73, Singapore at 113.08, and US at 94.1. When it comes to the region, Djibouti is the most connected at 34.8, followed by Kenya at 18.21 and Tanzania at 16.49. So Kenya and Tanzania, Emmanuel has helped us see that Kenya and Tanzania should be concerned about what's happening in El Mandeb region, because their ports, significant part of the trade volumes pass through, for Kenya and Tanzania, pass through the Suez Canal, and also Kenya and Tanzania make up 57% of the EAC GDP. So, and their ports also serve the region. So it's very important for Kenya to be concerned about the happenings at Suez Canal. So that's just a brief summary of what Emmanuel has shared through. I'd ask if anyone has a comment or question, they can raise their hand at this point. I'll give them opportunity to ask their question. Peter, you can go ahead. You can unmute your camera. I'm sorry, unmute your mic and go ahead. Peter, can you hear us?
Okay, as we wait for questions, I'll make a comment. So as we observe this crisis unfold, I think one thought I've had is that the economics of the tells you one thing, right? About how global prosperity is delivered, and even physically, if goods and services, if goods now, specifically physical goods, can move across borders with ease, um, it increases the choice for consumption and also creates opportunities for integration into global supply chains. So, for example, one may have some views about who the Emiratis are or who the Omanis or anyone else is. But then you look at the picture from the perspective of trade, and it will turn out that we're more integrated in economic activity than a pure ideological interpretation might imply, right? So ideology tells you one thing about how to allocate resources, and it's told the Houthis that the best way to allocate resources to disrupt global trade, right? Which is also a canny political calculation, because you do that and you get the emperor to come in and talk to you. If he's far off and he's not listening, then you can try and squeeze his trade, and you fly in and listen to you, right? But what does it actually mean for overall prosperity? Well, the economics tells us a different story about prosperity. Now, it doesn't tell us that you open borders and automatically everyone gets wealthier, but because there can be losers, and can be losers from trade, just as there are winners. But the question then becomes how to address those on the some of the problems that emerge, and to confront them honestly, but without resorting again to ideology. That's just one comment as we wait for questions.
Okay, thanks, Emmanuel, for that comment. So there's a question from Kwame. He asks, the attacks by the rebels is raising the costs in terms of human and material of the use of the Suez Canal. Being that this passage is an asset of the Egyptian Republic, how is that government responding? Can maybe answer that question as we wait others.
Yes. So I think now, from what I've seen, is that the Egyptians have not followed the Houthis on the one hand. They've not directly attacked them either or tried to prevent them from carrying out these attacks, but they've tried to play it as neutral as possible, as far as I can see. But yes, so that means trying to facilitate negotiations so that to bring the conflict in Israel, between Israel and Gaza, to an end as quickly as possible. So I think from what I can see, and I think it's a question that's worth exploring further. I think they're tied between not wanting to seem like the ideological ties, right? Or maybe the political hands are tied a little bit, but they don't outrightly go and say, yes, the Houthis are right, this should end and this should happen, but at the same time they try to facilitate negotiations. It's kind of along the lines of what the not exactly what the Houthis want, which is a violent and final end to the clashes, or a decisive end to the clashes, but rather, okay, what can we do to facilitate negotiations and not make this situation any easier? But we're not also going to open the borders for Palestinians to come in to Egypt. That's what I can see.
Okay, thanks, Emmanuel, for that response. So there being no other question, I think I'll just give you this opportunity to make your closing remarks. So yeah, Emmanuel, I'll give you an opportunity to make your closing remarks, and then we'll end this session. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll make my final statement. You can still put up a question if you want, and maybe we'll come back and answer a question. But now, the crisis at the Bab el Mandeb is emblematic of the challenges facing global trade today and policy making at the global level, right? Us, the economics tells us one thing about how to deliver economic prosperity, right? And it doesn't give us easy answers because we would still have to explain to parties involved why maybe, you know, if we're talking about just global trade in general, what can we do to make their transition easier into the global, the forum of global exchange? This is what we've seen even with the World Trade Organization's recent ministerial, where they've attempted to add more facilitation for lower, least developed countries as they ascend through and join the World Trade Organization. The attack by the Houthis on global trade is fueled by tensions that are not exactly informed by what would be, let's say, the most economically amenable way out of the situation. This one of the situations being the poverty and strife faced by the Yemenis themselves, right? So there's what the Yemenis are going through. There's what this specific group that claims to represent the Yemenis also is claiming to be trying to achieve with this attack on global trade. It's exacting a cost on global on global trade, and we can see that with the rising insurance costs, and then the direct costs incurred by merchant vessel operators, the indirect costs exacted by insurance brokers, and then the other indirect cost exacted by the whole situation on those who need intermediates in their manufacturing. And then trying to solve this problem, there's also the suspicions that the crisis is benefiting others who should be seen, who, as members of the United Nations Security Council, should be at the forefront of delivering certain kinds of public goods that weaker, smaller nations just cannot, right? The Russians and the Chinese. We've seen the Americans provide public goods in terms of sending ships and military assets to try and suppress the Houthi activities. There are cynical views about what the United States does, but by virtue of having a big economy and an economy that's as big as it is, and the demand its magnitude of trade actually exacts on its political system to try and maintain those avenues of trade, right, means that they will be active on the global scene. But from what we've seen from the Russians and the Chinese, it's not a given that global power would just deliver public goods that would benefit everyone. Because China, as we've seen from the data, is more interconnected with the world, right, in terms of that specific indice that we saw. But yet they've not been so quick to suppress the piracy activity, right? So I think all that put together is just saying, look, there are many matters going on in global policy making today. Countries like Kenya and Tanzania in this specific situation should actually be showing more concern and should be more willing to deliver public goods because there is a cost that their people are incurring. They're not. But this is something that civil society and consumer protection groups could also pursue. I'll close that off by saying that this is an issue that we'll continue to pursue. We have a report that will be out by the end of this week on the same issue. There are all those deeper questions like how other actors like Egypt are responding, and we'll try to answer those also. But in the words of is it the infamous Paul Muad'Dib? He who can destroy a thing controls it. But that's not good for global trade. It's a cynical view on trade. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for that comprehensive presentation. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This presentation will be uploaded on our website. You can also check out our social media pages on X, Facebook, and other social media platforms for any more information and other webinars that will be coming up. IEA is also a membership organization. Feel free to reach out to our communications team if you would like to be a member of IEA. Thank you so much and have yourselves a good afternoon.